Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika, an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you so much. Cuba has released 3 of its political prisoners as part of a continued warming of relations with the United States. With little fanfare, Cuban authorities released Diango and Bianco Vargas Martin, the 19-year-old twins who are members of an anti-government group called Patriotic Union of Cuba, and a third prisoner named Enrique Figueroa Miranda. Cuba has agreed to release a total of 53 political prisoners in exchange for full diplomatic ties with the U.S. and a long-term pledge to weaken the economic embargo. Meanwhile, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, who is the son of Cuban immigrants, has said he will push his fellow Republicans to block President Obama's efforts at a détente with Cuba. Well, Chenjerai, it appears as though the deal between the U.S. and Cuba is moving along quite fast. Do you foresee that the GOP could really be able to halt this moving train?
They may be able to halt it temporarily. You know, the GOP has a bit of a contradiction in its position on Cuba. They like to hold Cuba up symbolically as a communist enemy, but there's also some of the corporate partners that the GOP represents, I think, would very much like to construct Cuba as a sort of colonial state in the vein of, Puerto Rico or something like that. So I think that that's a contradiction there, and I think Obama is counting that the larger business interests who would ultimately like to get their, designs on Cuba, I think he's counting on that.
And it's interesting because, of course, a lot of the political prisoners that the right-wing Cuban community in Miami wants to see released are being released.
That's true also, but it's kind of a hypocritical position for the U.S. to be the party that's forcing that. I mean, I think it's good when political prisoners are released, but it's, the U.S. has its own political prisoners, and at the same time is trying to create extradite Assata Shakur to make her a political prisoner here. So it's an interesting hypocrisy there.
Right, exactly. Assata Shakur, an American activist, black liberation activist who is in exile in Cuba. A new study published this morning in Nature has identified those fossil fuel resources that need to remain in the ground if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change. Researchers at University College London found that 82% of extractable coal, 49% of natural gas, and 33% of oil needs to be left unburned if we want to survive as a species. The study most heavily implicates U.S. coal, Canadian tar sands, and Arctic oil and gas, all targets of climate justice activists. If fossil fuels are burned at their current rate, the Earth is set on a path towards 5 degrees Celsius of warming, when we as humans can only withstand 2 degrees of warming. Meanwhile, much of the United States is currently in the grips of an Arctic front moving over the continent, with the National Weather Service warning of, quote, dangerously cold air, prompting the delay of school openings from Alabama to the Dakotas. Extreme weather swings are a hallmark of climate change. Well, Chenjerai, will governments and energy companies take this research seriously and change their future plans for extraction?
Well, I certainly hope so, because we just understand now that we've entered a zone in which the changes have already begun and are catastrophic. But if we look at the contracts that companies like ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell made a while back, what we see is that they've made contracts to develop some of the largest oil reserves in countries that have those reserves. So it doesn't look like we're going to get it from the corporate sector. And then from government, we also don't see those priorities. I mean, it's interesting that today we also have this commitment from the GOP to move forward with the Keystone XL pipeline. And Obama, it's funny, Bill McKibben years ago, Bill McKibben, who pointed out these very problems that are now Nature is confirming years ago, pointed out that the American Petroleum Institute kind of seems to have been applying pressure to Obama and told him that if you don't do what we say on Keystone XL, there's going to be political troubles. So I'm worried.
Right, and we will be covering that political battle in Congress in the next days and weeks. Finally, 2 civil rights groups have just petitioned the United States Supreme Court to take on Wisconsin's controversial voter ID law. The court had blocked the law using an emergency stay ahead of November's midterm elections. Now, the Advancement Project and the American Civil Liberties Union have asked justices to resolve the issue ahead of the next major elections in 2016. Wisconsin's law requires strict voter identification in order to cast votes, which Governor Scott Walker justified as necessary to combating voter fraud But voting rights advocates say that it unfairly impacts younger voters, the elderly, and voters of color, and their position is backed by many reports documenting that voter disenfranchisement is a far greater problem than voter fraud. Chenjerai, given that the Supreme Court some years back had actually voided Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that enabled states to now change voting laws without permission, how likely is it that the justices will side with voters?
I don't think it looks very likely. But first, let's just say that, voter fraud, this problem of voter fraud is a myth. If we see Rutgers political scientist Lorraine Minnitt showed in her book called The Myth of Voter Fraud that prosecutions for migratory bird violations are actually more common, far more common than election fraud in the 2005 fiscal year. But if we look at Section 2, which is what we have left now that the Supreme Court has eviscerated Section 4, what we can see is most court cases involving Section 2 are limited to redistricting, and that issue is something that unfortunately is a little bit vulnerable to being captured by a wealthy political party. So I hope that we can push forward with Section 2, but it doesn't look very encouraging.
Chenjerai, thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you very much.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is our daily newsflash guest expert on Thursdays. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.